Hi there, and welcome to Traceability for Abatoirs. I'm Judith Kirkness, and I'm your presenter for today. So just a little bit about me. I am a family business owner with my husband. We own Minotaur Software, and we have focused on helping food manufacturers, the small to mid-sized companies, not the giants, to automate their facilities, their plant, their warehouse, their office, for traceability, for inventory control, and just really to bring together things that many people are doing in separate, disconnected programs. So over the many years, we've been in business 36 years, and over those years, we've learned a lot working with our customers. And I put a lot of what I have learned into a couple of books that I've written on traceability. I'm also a contributing author of another publication on traceability. So I bring over 20 years experience working with actual meat processors to the table. And I love talking about this subject and speaking and trying to educate people and help them to determine what might be the best technology and how they can practically implement those solutions. So let's get started. So my goals for the webinar today are basically just to talk about some of the automation options for abattoirs, talk about some of the challenges in automating in this in the particular abattoir environment, which we know is cold, it's wet, it's not really kind to technology in general. To also introduce some of the big picture concepts of tech so that when you're talking with people, you'll have a better understanding of some of these things that they may be proposing. And then to share some of the tips that I've learned from working with my customers that hopefully you can learn from. One of the key things when you're looking to automate anything is to really identify your goals. So it's good to know what you want to get out of automating and not just automate for the sake of automating. So many people are looking for that traceability or to keep up with those record-keeping requirements that the government has. Maybe they're looking to get some type of a global food safety initiative program so they can sell to bigger customers, whether that be the large retailers or some of the large food service chains. Others are looking to reduce mistakes and figure out where they can make things more efficient in the plant. We all know that staff is very challenging to get and to keep in the meat industry, and so making things as easy for the existing staff and also easy for new staff to learn is often another goal for automation. Now, depending on what you do, whether you're doing custom kill or whether you're buying animals and creating some products for yourself, you may really be interested in calculating and monitoring costs, because it's kind of hard when you know the cost you paid for, a side coming in or an animal coming in based on the hot weight. But then now you've got to kind of calculate costs for all of those things you made from that particular animal, and then flow that through to what you sell it for to determine, are you really making money on that? Other people are looking to try and increase the throughput of their facility. So knowing that maybe they're not able to make their plant any bigger, so they want to be as efficient as possible and maximize the number of animals that they can process in a day. Inspectors here often have to be on site for the kill process. So that means that you need to maximize that time that you get the inspector there and get as many animals through that facility as you can. And of course, if you are a custom cut wrap, custom kill operation, then you really only get one chance to get the right meat back to the right customer. And so making that efficient and reducing the time it takes to keep track of that meat around the plant is another key goal that I hear from many of my customers. Now, you might hear some people talk about having, we've got full barn to customer traceability. And, while it's never easy to keep track of all of these things in a plant, there are some things that are easier. And so what's easier? Well, if you're buying animals from your own farm, or you're just working with animals from your own farms, the traceability loop is pretty simple. You know where all of those animals came from. It may get a little more difficult if you're dealing with multiple barns and you're actually tracking that information. It's also easier if you are doing an operation where maybe you have customers who order a side from you, but you have the flexibility to decide what side you're going to use for that order, as opposed to saying, here's animal 1, 2, 3, and side A of that animal is going to Susan, and side B is going to Phil, and here are the cut sheets for those. And you don't have that flexibility of saying, okay, I'm going to choose this side for this order, and off we go and cut it. And then, of course, if you're just doing the, kill and maybe you're not doing a lot of cut wrap, you're primarily sending things out in either larger primals, or you don't do further processed items such as sausages, you're just doing a cut wrap. Again, those are easier than some of the situations people are dealing with. So what makes it harder? So if you're buying animals from multiple outside producers or multiple barns, and if you're tracking that meat right back to the animal ID, the producer or the barn, now not everybody is doing this in terms of they might be buying from outside producers, but maybe they just track what carcasses they took into a cut room, but they really don't know whether this particular steak came from carcass A, B, C, or whichever one that went into the cut room that day. So there are situations that make it not as challenging to create the traceability loop. And if you're combining meat from multiple carcasses in making a further processed items, then you're needing to track what animals went into that process or could be in that process should you ultimately ever be in a recall situation. And then if you're making further processed items, then you're also responsible for tracking all of those inputs that go into making those items. So whether it's your spices, your casings, any of those inputs, you've got to track those lots and link them with that particular batch of interim or finished product, so that if there was a recall again on, say, a spice or a casing lot, that you could go through and not have to recall everything because you didn't have any idea where you used it. And another thing that is harder than the initial, but not the hardest, is if you are using a standard recipe. So maybe, you're always starting off with 30 kilograms of meat in a particular sausage batch. Well, that's tricky. You've got to track the casings, you've got to track the spices. But if you're using a standard recipe, again, that at least gives you one standard that you're working for each item, instead of the next situation that really is the hardest that I've come across as far as tracking. So what have I found that is the hardest? Well, one, you've got the multiple supplying producers. And two, perhaps you're doing the custom kill situation where you have to get each of those farmers or their customers the right meat back, cut and wrapped to unique specifications for each side and sometimes even each quarter. And a lot of what I hear in the meat processors are that, they might do something like a sausage for a custom kill process. So they're collecting all the trim from that animal and then they're making sausages. But because they may not, they're not going to have the exact same amount of trim from each animal, so they're actually using a variable recipe. Many people are using Excel, and they're using a variable recipe to create a sausage recipe. So now you've got a unique recipe for each and every batch that you do. So now your staff really have to be careful about measuring. They're not measuring the same amount every time. They've got to really pay attention to that unique recipe, or you're going to get, something that's out of your flavor profile or specifications. And again, because you only get one chance to get it right for a custom kill situation, often people have to slow down to make sure that they get this right. And another one is that if you're doing a billing for these custom kill situations where you've got over and above items that you're billing for based on attributes, whether it's customer initiated attributes like keep the head on if it's a barbecue hog, or if it's something where you don't even know upon arrival whether this animal will be deemed, over 30 months, but if they are, then you have an extra fee associated with that. So if you've got a large number of attributes, then making sure that you actually get all of the relevant attributes onto the bill for a given customer is a challenge. And so you really got this goal of trying to figure out how to track each serial numbered animal through the plant, ensuring that everything you make from it is tied to that particular animal or the order, depending on how granular you get in what you can send back to your customer. So that's really the hardest I've found in traceability. It's harder than people who make cookies or things like that, because often you're cutting this very different based on the order for that specific customer. So in looking at some automation options and where you might consider adding automation to your process, I want to step back just, for 15 minutes or so and talk about the relevant tech concepts, because I think if you have an understanding of these as a base, and some of this will be review for many of you, but it's great for going into the next discussion of where and what might be automated. So first, let's begin by talking about networks. A network is a closed loop, and information flows back and forth across this loop. Some networks are wired, where you've got actual wires running in the plant and you're dropping wires for perhaps scale stations and things like that. Others are going to attempt to do everything wirelessly, which is great conceptually, but there certainly are some challenges in the wet, cold environment. I've certainly had some situations where, the way a network typically works is that you've got, if it's wires, you're connecting wires up to a hub, which is connected into a server, for example, or connected into a router going to the internet. So either there's a bunch of wires coming out, or you're attempting to do it wirelessly. With wirelessly, you've got access points. So, typically in a house, you've got a wireless network, and sometimes, depending on the size of your house, you have to put what are called like little extenders in different rooms if network signal can't reach all areas of your house. Well, exactly that same situation is relevant when setting up a wireless network in a plant, that you may need to put, a lot of plants are built with contained rooms. This is a room where this takes place. The kill takes place here. Then we've got the chilling in this cooler. Then we might have a freezer. Then we've got rooms, where cut wrap takes place. Other rooms where sausage making takes place. And when you've got all these divided rooms, especially when those rooms have a lot of, metal walls or cement walls, and if you've got hanging sides that have a high water content, it can mean that you end up having to put a wireless access point into each of those separate areas, because the signal can't flow through those walls or can't flow across all of those hanging sides. So establishing a wireless network is certainly doable, and there are some benefits, because there is some issues with, sometimes rodents get through and start gnawing on the wires of a wired network. But I've certainly found that wireless networks can be quite challenging to set up and costly, because you have to have a lot more wireless access points than you imagined you might, or certainly than you would in, say, a home. So I mentioned briefly that these all connect into a server. So software basically runs, any software that is designed to be shared across multiple computers is going to be running on a server. Now, it could be a server that's in the cloud, and when we say the cloud, we basically mean there's a giant data center with a bunch of servers somewhere that the software is placed on, and everyone is accessing that software over the internet. And you can have private data centers where you place software in this data center for your use by your company, or it can be the data center owned by the software program that you are using. A great analogy is to think of Netflix. So Netflix, it has its servers with all of the content that it has. You sign up, you pay a fee. If you pay the fee, you can access the server. They store your history of what you've been watching and what episode you're on their servers. And when you access the server, you can use the software. If you stop paying for the server, then you cannot use the software anymore. So that's kind of the difference between software as a service, meaning you pay, the data is not stored on your own computer, it is stored on this server somewhere, versus a server that's either a physical box, like in the upper right-hand corner, a physical server that might be at one of your locations, or a cloud server data center that is controlled by you, where it's not like if you stop paying the software provider that the software is inaccessible to you, because the software is actually on a server that you control. So those are kind of the differences between software as a service, server as a service, which because they're the same letters is often a confusing concept in servers. So basically, if the software is designed to be shared in multiple locations, whether that's multiple locations of your own company or multiple locations of a piece of equipment on the plant floor, either way, it will ultimately reside somewhere on a server and then travel over some kind of a network, whether that's the internet or whether that's a local area network just within your own facility, depends on the software program. Now, a lot of equipment that you're going to be buying has what we call IP ratings. So that actually stands for ingress protection. And that's really about how well the equipment withstands either solid objects or things like fingers or tools, or all the way down to objects that are very fine like dust or things like that, as well as ingress of liquids, such as either splashing of liquids or direct washdown with hoses, or even ultimately submersion of the equipment. So it's really determining how tightly the electrical components of a given piece of equipment are protected against either solids or liquids. And so the IP, ingress protection rating, that you'll often see on many of the equipment that is designed for plant floors that are, like the meat processing, is IP67. And so 6 is actually the highest level of dust protection. It can, people's fingers are not going to get at the electronics. The dust is not going to get at the electronics. And that's the first number after the IP, IP6. That's about the solids. The last number is about its enclosure protection against liquids. And so, 8 is the highest level for that number, for the liquids. That's like extended period submersion. So things that is supposed to be, say, fully outside. Think of your meter reading tank or something like that for hydro. It's got to have really solid equipment because it's going to be out there exposed to elements for long periods of time. Not typically submerged in that case, but certainly exposed to long periods of time. So IP ratings are something you will see on devices, and a lot of devices, things like deli scales, they are not really meant for the processing environment where there's any kind of wash, like, hose, high pressure hose wash downs, things like that. So watch your equipment and think about your environment and what it will be exposed to when you're trying to decide how much to spend or what kind of rating to look for in equipment. It is important in an environment as harsh as a meat processing plant. So we've got our networks, we've got our servers, we've got equipment that will have electrical components that will need to connect this. So now, one of the important things to remember is that not all equipment was designed to operate on a network. So again, going back to my Netflix analogy, think of your old TVs. They just simply weren't capable of running Netflix. Many plants that I visit have things like rail scales, and something goes across the rail scale, weight shows up, great, moves along, and weight goes away. It's not storing anything. It's not sending that information anywhere. It's just, you see it. Yes, you can write it down if you want, but it's not designed as a network piece of equipment. Now, when people talk about a network scale, it's kind of confusing because it's not really the scale base, whether that's the hanging scale or the the bench or the floor scale that is the issue. It's actually the indicator that typically is the piece that gets networked into a network to share information. So, you might have a scale base that where you need to swap out an indicator to make it networkable, but you don't have to swap out the entire scale. Also, if you see in the upper right-hand corner, this is a serial connector, and also called an RS-232 connector. And there are a lot of serial devices out there, and they are like Energizer bunnies. They just keep going and going. Microsoft, in their wisdom, stopped supporting serial devices many, many years ago. That doesn't mean they stopped working, of course. It just means that Microsoft is not going to do much if your serial device is not working against a Microsoft program. They are not going to go investigating that. They feel that serial devices are outdated, and so, they're so big they can do that. So when we talk about networking some of the equipment on the plant floor, some software programs will want you to have a networkable indicator so that information can flow across the network to the piece of software. Some will need you to have networkable label printers so that when the server that's doing the work figures out what label, it knows where to send that label. Now, IP, we talked about IP as in that ingress. Let me just go back up again. Remember ingress protection ratings. IP has another meaning in the computer world, which is, you might hear people talk about an IP address, like 123.456.789. And that is it's like an address where we can send information to, say, a printer might have, a network printer would have an IP address, so a software program could know how to share that network printer around everyone in your office by saying, okay, whenever anyone clicks this printer in the drop-down of printers, you go to this IP address. So there's kind of two IPs to be aware of in the computer world. So let's talk about some barcode scanners now. Now, there are simple scanners like the one on the right at the bottom. There's no screen on that. All it's doing, it's called a wedge scanner, is transmitting whatever it is, the numbers that it sees with the scanner through to whatever program is on the other end. It doesn't have the program inside the device. It's just a very simple scanner. Compared to the unit on the left here, which is actually a full handheld computer. It has intelligence. It has an ability to connect to a network. It may run actual software on the device, or you may connect the device to a server, over the network and run software on the server. Some people will say to me, well, why can't I just use my phone as my scanner? But phones actually don't really scan things. They actually take pictures. So, when you're talking about a QR code, yes, you can take a picture of that with your phone and that can link to a website, but it's not, that's not really a scanner per se. So I actually do have this cool little hybrid device that I use when I'm doing demos because it can make my phone into a scanner, but it is not at all rated for the kind of environments. Another thing to think of when we talked about, going in and out of a cooler or freezer, some people have found that their handheld computers, like the ones on the left, will struggle if they don't get the kinds that are meant for those environments, those freezer temperatures, or the going in and out. It's kind of like glasses, how they fog up, when you go between different temperatures. Well, the devices can have some challenges that way as well. So you'll want to think about that when you're trying to decide what hardware is best for what your staff are going to be using it for. Now, in the meat industry, we have the standard barcode is like the one shown here on the left. It's actually called a code 128. It's also called a GS1 128 or an EAN 128. And it's the format. This is actually my favorite barcode, and I know that's very geeky of me. But what's so wonderful about this barcode is that you can pick up all the pieces of information in a single scan. So as long as your software program can break apart those pieces into the components, then a single scan can get you all that information. Now, that same information can be coded in a little QR square or data matrix barcode, like the square one on the upper right of this mock label, or it can be what's called a 1D or linear barcode. And the reason it's called 1D, when you sort of think, well, it kind of looks two-dimensional to me, but it's 1D because think of the old barcode scanners where they had you would put a line over top of that, and there would be like this red line, and so it's cutting across this barcode in one dimension. You can't turn your scanner sideways. You must read it across that way in order to grab the information. So that's why it's called a 1D barcode. Now, there's actually 99 possible segments that you can have in these code 128 barcodes, and different industries have chosen different segments based on what information they want to track with that single scan. So the barcode that I've created here for our test purposes actually has 4 segments. The O1 segment, which is the little bracketed section. After that is the item code. So it doesn't have to be 18 characters. It can just be up to 18 characters long. The next one, the 3102, is the weight in kilograms of this case up to 2 decimal points. So if you look in the human readable, you see the weight was 10 kilograms exactly. So that's what's in the 3102 section. The 11 is a production date. So the date, in this case, it's an old label that we printed years ago. It was 2018, March 7th. So that is the production date. Then the final piece is the 21, which is a serial number. Now, I've got quite a short serial number there, but that serial number can actually be up to 20 characters in length, which is really valuable when we start to get to RFID numbers very shortly. Now, some of the other segments that might interest you is the 422 segment, which is a country of origin. Or if you see a 3202 or 3201, it's basically the weight in pounds. So depending on if you are doing any kind of importing or buying of product that came in from outside of Canada, then you might have other segments in your barcodes, not just these key ones that are very common in the meat industry. Now let's take a look at some of the other kinds of barcodes that you see out being used in our in retail stores today. So the top one, we used to call this a UPC, which stood for Universal Product Code. But GS1, which is the nonprofit organization that tries to ensure that there are no duplicate barcodes in the world, decided to change the terminology. And when they joined with EAN, the European organization that was doing barcodes, and so they changed it to, in this case, it's called a GTIN 12, and that means that there are 12 digits from left to right. And it's a global trade identification number. So they changed the flavor, but many of us still call it a UPC. Either way, the important thing to realize is that embedded in the UPC is typically a supplier prefix that you would pay GS1 to get. And then you have a certain number of characters to make however many item codes. So if you got 4 characters to make item codes, then you could make up to 9,999 different items with this. If you got 3 characters that you paid for, you could make 999. So depending on how many you pay for, that's how many will be available to you that will not be given to anybody else in the world. So the important thing here is to realize is that it's got an item identifier, and often embedded in this is a company identifier. It doesn't have anything to do with traceability. It doesn't tell you when this product expires, doesn't tell you when the product was made, it doesn't tell you the lot number. So that's really important when we're talking about traceability, because if that's not going to give us the information that we need, then we can't use this barcode for traceability. Similarly, the barcode down at the bottom is actually a GTIN 14, so Global Trade Identification Number, that's 14 digits long, and it is one that is used on cases. So you might have, let's picture granola bars. So maybe you have a master case that has 12 boxes of granola bars. So the inner granola bars have a UPC. That's the unit that grocery stores would sell. And so that's the UPC that would be scanned at the grocery mart. However, they would never sell, as the manufacturer of granola bars, a single box. They just don't do that. They're manufacturing. The smallest unit they would sell would be a case. So for them, they embed the item number into this 14-digit case code, but it also, on GS1, they register both of these numbers, and they would say, in this case code contains 12 of this other UPC at the top. So in that sense, you can have one item, like a granola bar, have multiple barcodes relevant to it that are registered with GS1. Now, you don't have to register with GS1 if all you're doing is internal to your own business. And so that's important to know. But the syntax that they've developed allows software developers like me to create a consistent program where you can make up your own internal barcodes using the syntax so that we can have a universal program. Here's the final one you're probably quite familiar with in the meat industry, and that is your deli barcodes. And once again, they have an item, but they don't say anything about where this product came, not on the barcode, and they often have a price embedded in it. And so it's really, once again, not usable for traceability. They don't say anything about where that product came from. They don't say anything about when it expires, when it was made, any of that information. So again, these are great for pricing at a POS system, but they do not help you with traceability. Now let's talk about RFID briefly. There's a lot of RFID tags on the animals in Canada coming into the slaughterhouses, and they contain typically 15-digit numbers, but there's actually some that are even longer, up to 20 digits in length. And the 124 at the beginning of many of these tags actually is the country code for Canada. So if you ever happen to have animals, I know some of the hog people might have animals coming across the border or going across the border. 124 is the Canadian prefix and 840 is the US. So there's different kinds of readers that you can get to read these tags. Most people would have a wand reader, like the one on the right, but there are also fixed panel readers, like in my upper right here photo. So there are stationary readers. It can be had, but there's a lot of challenge right now because a lot of these readers, so the wand readers are often not what we call wedge readers, meaning think of that simple barcode scanner that we looked at in the slide earlier, where all it was doing was passing the information through to another program. Many of these wand readers were designed for use out in the field, which means that they don't need to be on a network, and they've got a program running on them, and often you can't get the information until you dock the device. So, that means that you can't necessarily use the information right away unless you want to go back and forth and dock it. So some people will think, well, you know what, maybe a stationary reader is the best thing. But there's actually a lot of challenges with the stationary readers picking up various codes, and unless you're separating the animals one by one when you're offloading, which many, many, many people are not doing. Finally, let's talk about printers. So there's two ways that you can print from a printer, and many printers have the ability to do both options, and that is thermal transfer, where there's a ribbon and they're transferring some of that film from the ribbon onto the label, or there's direct thermal. And so they do operate a little bit better in different temperature ranges, so you want to think about that. And think about old fax paper was direct thermal, and your receipts from the grocery store are direct thermal. And so you know how those don't necessarily last forever, and certain things like sitting them on the dashboard of your car can make them last a lot less long than they would if they're out of sunlight. So which you choose really kind of depends on the temperature range and how long you need it to last for. And most printers still need to be put into a IP rated container, like an enclosure, because most of these, in order to be able to be very easy to open up and keep changing and adding new labels stock, it's not really rated for a wash down on its own. Now, tagging and media. So media is the term for labels or tags or whatever it is you're putting through your label printer to print on. And then I've had customers recently be very happy with the Avery Dennison Mark III tagging gun that you can see in the bottom right here. And you can get that right from Avery Dennison Canada. And then you can get various colored tags that load up, and they are great for putting your tags on. Here is actually a sample that I took an image of some waterproof tagging material with a die cut hole in it. That's from a Mississauga supplier. So certainly if you're planning to ultimately print tags either at your hot weight station or at a cold weight station or things like that, there's lots of options for making tags that will withstand the cold and wet environment. So now we've talked about the tech. Let's get back to automation. So depending on the size of your business, again, we don't want to automate for the sake of automating. We want to decide, is part of your goals to grow your company? Are you just looking for efficiency gains to get, a few extra animals in each day? What are the things that are really taking your staff the longest, or maybe the things that are costly because staff keep getting it wrong? The more you can make a consistent process, it's easier to train new staff. And the reality is that quite frankly, a lot of young people are so used to using phones and things like that. In order to retain talent, we sometimes need to implement technology because that's kind of the expectation of young people, that they're not, they don't really want you to hand them a pen and have them fill out a bunch of forms. So some of the values that you can get by connecting pieces of your plant floor in with, your office or in with your warehouse is the fact that, you can things like setting up a new item codes or updating pricing if any of your labels have pricing on them. If you have disconnected units, you've got to go out to each one of those units and update them individually on the cold plant floor. If things are connected, well, you can do it centrally, and that information can feed out to all those devices. Another way is that you can receive information from the plant floor. So we talked about some of the billing being very challenging for abattoirs, especially in the custom kill space where you've got a lot of these different attributes and you're trying to make sure that you don't leave money on the table. And so, there's information that needs to flow in a timely way back from the plant floor for the purposes of billing. Some of the abattoirs I deal with, they take the total weight of, a given carcass and send that back to the producer and say, okay, well, I've got 6 cut sheets. Which ones do you want me to use on which animals? And here are the weights so you can decide. So, there's a lot of situations where you've got a lot of information flowing back and forth to provide good customer service for your customers. And when you're doing it all manually, things can get lost, whether you can't read someone's writing, whether, something splashes on it and you can't read it because it got wet. It's not a great environment for pen and paper, as you guys know very well. And, better yet, you can pass that information to a software program so that it can help check and verify things. So think of scanning. If you're going to scan to pick an order, let's say you stock inventory of products because you buy animals and you produce product. Well, if your software program is live as opposed to one that needs to go and dock before you know anything about it, well, let's say somebody, some on the order says to order some ribeyes and the guy in the plant accidentally scans a different product. Well, if things are live, that can beep and stop the guy right then and there to say, hey, wait a minute, this is not on that order. So having a two-way communication or a live communication can bring a lot of value and reduce mistakes. It's always great to be able to report on information, start to aggregate information and see trends over time. So for instance, maybe it's your live to hot weight or hot to cold weight, and you're looking for what are your true averages in your plant based on things. So when people say to you, well, if my cow weighs 1,000 pounds, how much meat can I actually expect to get out? Well, it's, there are of course industry standards or averages that people will refer to, but it's always good to know what's yours. Is there a different when different people are working? Is there a difference? What are the things that can affect that? Without information, you can't look at that in a critical way. And then just integrating information from one program to another, or using it for things like traceability reporting or invoicing. Those are all values that you can get by connecting the equipment. I want to just take a look at this list here, because when I go in and talk to a lot of abattoirs, you have systems. Like, we all know that you've got systems for recording the animals that arrive. You've got systems for recording all the hot weight, and if you've done the acid wash, you've got systems. Many of those systems might be handwritten lists, or some recipes or things like that might be in Excel. You've probably got an accounting program. Maybe that's separate from your POS program, and maybe that's separate from all of your labeling programs. I found that with my customers, they had an average of about 11 separate disconnected systems that they were using. And when information is disconnected, it just means it's going to take you a lot longer to combine that information, if you ever have time to combine that information, to get some of that interesting reporting out the other side. When we're considering automating, there's different steps that you might look at automating. Booking scheduling is one of the things that customers can spend a lot of time on, because you're booking people so far into the future. And so you've got to basically say, okay, this is when I can fit you in 2023 on February 22nd, but you've got to make sure you manage cancellations, fill spots. You've got to collect the right cut sheets. You've got to remind the people of their appointments so they don't forget, confirm how many animals they're bringing, all of those things. But automating that process is not easy for a lot of standard programs, because things like cancellations, email instructions, you can't really just use a regular scheduling program that you might, buy a little app for, because it doesn't necessarily apply well to this situation. We all know that you might make exceptions and do an extra animal on a day for a good customer, or things like that. So when you're thinking about automating that, those are the considerations that you have to keep in mind. Receiving. As I said, if you are separating the animals one by one, maybe you're doing a live weight scale, which not a lot of companies are, but some are, then you have the luxury of ensuring that the animals are filtered, and you have time with each one to ensure you can read the RFID tag, and you can check that it's active and put another one on if it is not working. Whereas if they're all coming barreling off the truck at a given time, then you are not necessarily going to be able to catch all the tags. I've heard this especially with the animals coming off lambs and things where it's put on the leg. That's one of the challenges for the panel readers, is that, you have to have the panel reader up a certain height to hit the ear of a cow. You might end up having to have two panel readers, one down low to fit the ankle or the leg of a lamb or sheep type of thing. So depending on the range of species that you do, it can get tricky. So certainly the wand readers are great, but if you can't separate animals, you may not be able to wand those as fast as those animals can get off the trucks. Knockbox. A knockbox is often where your operator needs information to flow to them, more so than they need to send information to you. And that is, a lot of times you're doing this with a barn card right now. And so there is the option that if you've logged the information at receiving as to what animal should be treated what way, that if you scan that ear tag again at knockbox, the information of how to treat those animals could show to the operator. So this is one where I would say not too many people are doing this yet, but this is something that a lot of my customers are starting to add in. And we're working on a project right now with a customer to have the full knockbox operator information. So I feel like it's coming. Inspection station is another one where I feel it's coming, but we are of course at the mercy of our government as to whether or not the inspectors would agree to do this. Otherwise, you might end up dedicating a staff member, which is not necessarily the best use of their time, to record the information about whether something failed. So a lot of people are actually pushing the inspection information through to the next station, which is the hot weigh station. And so here they're scanning the RFID tag, and that will be used to retire the animals at the end of the day. And they are recording any of those things such as OTM, anything that's condemned, just with kind of check boxes on that hot weight station. So the animal might stay in front of you for 30 seconds while you check off the various characteristics, but the wonderful thing is that for people running our system, it is flowing through to the invoice automatically. So it's saving a lot of time on the other end. The cold weight station, again, not a lot of people are necessarily doing that unless they are selling animals to retailers, say sides to a butcher shop in a big retailer, and they are actually billing out on the cold weight. Most of the abattoirs that are doing custom kill are primarily using the hot weight. Cut wrap. You know, a lot of people have those separate standalone weigh label stations, and it's really a matter of how do we tie everything that we're producing from this particular carcass both to the order against the cut sheet, that we do it right, and we get all the pieces tied to what carcass it came from for that traceability piece. So there's the option, if you've got your hang tag and your hang tag has a barcode on it, it can allow the next stage of the program to have something to scan in while you weigh and label all the outgoing products. There's still a lot of challenges with this piece. A lot of the people I see will actually cut cut the side and do all the cut wrap pieces, pile them up, and then take them over to a station and weigh and label. So some people have to put multiple tags in order to have something in different rooms to be able to scan to tie it to either the order or the particular carcass. Further processed items present another real challenge, especially if you are creating a recipe and not able to use a standard. I know one of my abattoirs that does only custom kill, they nonetheless use a standard recipe and basically say, I will only do sausages in a 25-pound increment. So if you have 40 pounds of trim, well then I'm grinding up, I'll take 25 and make it into your sausages, but the other is going to be put into, ground beef, for example. So that was one way they got around the concept of having to create a special recipe for each and every sausage process. But certainly I know a lot of my other customers, nope, they create from the trim, they take that sausage input and they create the recipe, whether they're doing it in Excel or like in our program that does that for them. So just a little bit about, my program and the Minotaur system, all the different pieces that it has. We continue to develop for the abattoir space and are always trying to make sure that we enhance the program and simplify it as much as possible for the people on the floor, knowing. And one of the ways we do that is there's the option to have the multiple languages for the operators as they approach the screen. So that can be very handy because we know that finding, retaining people is key, and reducing mistakes by people using their native language is one way of reducing those mistakes. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I'd certainly welcome any of your questions. Email me and let me know how I can help you. This is what we do. As you can tell, I love doing this, and we really enjoy helping our meat processors automate whatever makes sense for them to automate in their plant.